That was newly elected MHKs Michelle Hayward and Stu Peters, the Morecambe and Wise of Manx politics. In last week's agenda, the Quayle administration got a bit of a battering from former Chief Ministers Alan Bell and Tony Brown. Minister David Ashford was keen to offer a diplomatically robust rebuttal. You'd be delighted with the election results, so perhaps we should start there. How was the election for you?
Well, obviously for me, it was a great success. My vote and also the percentage of people who turned out to vote for me were both up by a third on the previous election. And I'm delighted that the people of Douglas North decided they were happy to have me for a second term representing them.
Clearer priorities for government, maybe less priority?
Yeah, I think this needs to be a very focused government. I think if we don't have that focus, you do end up in exactly that case where you're trying to do 150 different things and you do them all partially, but not necessarily do them all well. And I think what we need is a government that actually has an overarching vision. So where they want the island to go, and then off that there's 5 or 6 big headings that then departments are tasked to deliver over the 5 years and really drill down and focus on what we can deliver rather than having 10,000 KPIs, some of which will be met, some of which won't, and it'll be a mixed bag. I think we've really got to be focused over the next 5 years.
Any of the senior civil servants listening to many of the election debates must be feeling a bit disillusioned. Have we got a problem with morale across the senior government staff?
Well, I would hope not, because I would hope that people see it as an opportunity for change and view it as an opportunity. I've worked, and I said this in my hustings, I've worked in government now for 5 years, 4 years as a minister, a year as a member of the Cabinet Office, and I've found the vast majority of civil servants engaging. As in any organisation, there are people who need to have increased performance reviews and potentially up their game, but the overwhelming majority are dedicated to serving the island. And as I've found as Minister for Health and Social Care, with us bringing in the changes with Manx Care, people are actually very enthusiastic if they can see the purpose of the change. I think what people worry about is change for change's sake. And I think if you look back historically, sometimes that has happened in government.
Surely not.
You say tongue in cheek there, Phil, but I think there has been. Change for change's sake in the past, and I think as long as you show to people, same in any private sector organisation as well, that you're on a path and this is what it leads to, then people will buy in and people will engage. But certainly I have found the overwhelming amount of civil servants I've dealt with to be exceptionally professional people and exceptionally hard-working people.
One of the reasons I was quite keen to get you on the programme this week is last week we had Alan Bell and Tony Brown, both former chief ministers, both very experienced Manx politicians, and they were assessing the election result, and I think they described it as a disastrous result for government. They also then suggested that part of this was down to the media policy that government has adopted over the last 5 years, where media minders, for want of a better word, seem less eager to support the media in getting various queries answered. Is it fair, do you think, that, first of all, the charge that we've had a disastrous result for government?
In the first part, I don't think it is fair. It's one of those rare occasions where I'm not going to agree with Alan and Tony on this. And the reason being, I don't think you can read Manx politics in that same way. It's not set up like, for instance, in the UK, where you can look at a result and you can say that was a disastrous night for the Conservative government.
But it is the first time that so many ministers have lost their seat. I mean, I think 2 ministers have lost their seat in the previous...
Well, actually, interestingly, with you raising that, if you go back over the last 20 years and look at it, so if you take this election, it was 4 ministers, 3 backbenchers, with 7 members losing their seats. 2016, 5 sitting members lost their seat, which was 1 minister, 4 backbenchers. In 2011, that was also 5 sitting members, and that was 3 ministers and 2 backbenchers. And also in 2006, there was 1 minister, 2 backbenchers, and in 2001, one minister and one backbencher. So actually, if you go back over 20 years, there's been 22 members that have lost their seats, 10 ministers and 12 backbenchers. So it's actually been quite even. And even at this election, there was 4 ministers went, but there was 3 backbenchers as well. So, you can't read into it, because I think here on the island, we fight very much individual election campaigns. And to be frank, if this was a vote against government, I'm in the Department of Health and Social Care, which has had various names over the years, from being the poison chalice of government, to being the
you should
one
try
of the
the
hardest.
DOI.
Yeah, well, maybe I've passed the chalice on over the last few years, and I know it's been referred to previously. But you've had Department of Health and Social Care, which has been called the poison chalice, and so on. And my vote went up by a third. Both in terms of the percentage of people going out to vote for me and the numbers. So I don't think you can read that into it, because you went round all the hustings and people are very much focused on who they want to represent them in their individual area, who they believe will do a good job at representing them in the House of Keys. So I don't think it's quite as clear cut. So
and again, one of the things at all the election meetings that I went to, there was very little talk about national government, the big agenda for how government changes people's lives in a fairly dramatic way. It was very much about detail, the potholes, the state of the roads, pavements, these sorts of things. Does that not mean that perhaps government is at best struggling to get its message over?
I think it's what matters to individual people on the ground, and it's what people are struggling with at any one time. And the things certainly I think that are at the forefront of people's minds at the moment are the roads, because they see them every day. It is affordable housing as well. That was another big one, certainly came up a lot in Douglas North. And now, having watched back previous hustings, now the election campaign's over and I've got time to do that, I've noticed that came up quite a lot. So although they were issues that affected people on the ground, they are still national issues. But like I say, I don't think you can read into 4 ministers losing their seats in individual constituencies saying that's a vote against government, any more than you can at the previous election, where it was 1 minister and 4 backbenchers, and say, well, people weren't supporting the backbenchers. You can have very vocal backbenchers over the years who have criticised government, been at the forefront of scrutiny, who have then gone on to lose their seats. So I don't think you can extrapolate it in that way. And the other difference we had this time was we had a very high proportion of council and ministers seeking re-election. We had 7 of the 9 ministers, which hasn't always been the case in previous elections. In fact, I think in 2016 there was only actually 3 members of council and ministers, if I remember rightly, that were actually seeking re-election. Yourself, Howard and Lawrence, I think, was the 3. So it's not always, so that can change things as well, depending upon the proportions. So I don't think it was a vote either way. I don't think it was a vote in favour of government or a vote against. I think it was people in the individual constituencies going out and saying, that is the person I want to represent me for the next 5 years.
And in terms of communication, is there a breakdown in relations between the media and government at the moment? Is there something that needs to be done to perhaps maybe olive branches need to be offered so that the media can actually have the access that it rightfully should have in a free democracy? Well,
you used the phrase media minders before, and I can safely say I've never had a media minder. In fact, most people would probably want to be put on me to keep me off the radio the amount of times I've been on over the last few years. I think we can improve communications. I said in Tynwald this morning when we were debating around the COVID-19 regulations that basically anyone who says communications are perfect in any walk of life is either deluded or lying. There's always room for improvement. And I think we do need to look at the way we get our message out and our message across. And I think it's good for us to do that on a regular basis. And that's via engagement with the government comms teams, direct engagement with the media outlets such as Manx Radio. And like I say, I've never been shy of coming forward. In fact, like I say, people probably pay to get me off the radio rather than the other way around.
I'm sure they do that for me too. All the sitting candidates who were putting themselves forward for election use fairly obfuscatory language to say, well, of course, this should. In fact, I remember you saying this yourself about affordable housing. This should be a priority for the next 5 years. And you're thinking, well, haven't you been elected to deal with these issues? And why was it not a priority before this election? Why has it just suddenly become a priority? And how do you actually hold people to account. So I suppose the long-winded question here, what would you hope that people would judge you on in 5 years' time? What would be the key elements of your performance that you'd be looking for the electorate to consider?
So taking the last bit first, because that's, I think, the most important part of the question. I think when it comes to judging an MHK, they should be judged by their actions as to what they did actually do, or what did they try to do. We are all independents. I've always been quite clear. I lay out normally quite a detailed manifesto, because people have a right, I think, to know what I'll be fighting for, and people should judge me on that. They should actually say, well, even if you didn't achieve it, what did you do to try and achieve it? Because there will be occasions where you will walk, and as well as I do, you can walk into the House of Keys and you say that is the right approach, that is what I want to do, and 23 other people say no, it's not. We're not doing it that way. But I think what you want to see is MHKs who stand by their manifesto actually fight for what they believe in, and should they change their minds, and it is possible as events happen, an MHK might change their mind, that they can justify to their electorate why they changed their mind and what was the reason. And affordable housing, which was the first one you raised, obviously that was asked on the doorstep. I'm quite happy to answer that, which is things have fundamentally changed just in the last 2 years. With the pandemic and everything else, we've seen huge demand for housing, and prices have been going up through the roof. So the pressure has become more real than it was at the start or even the midpoint of the last administration. And that's why it's now, in my point of view, reaching crisis point. It's not something that's been dragging on for 8 years. If you look at the actual economic reports that show the level of percentage of income compared to house prices, it's been pretty static. It's things that we've started to see in the last 18 months that have driven me to say it needs to now be tackled urgently.
And of course, DOI has a responsibility, and I say a responsibility for housing. It is responsible, I think, for delivering the housing legislation, and it also has a responsibility for delivering and indeed overseeing public sector housing. But interestingly, the outgoing Minister for DOI at his election meeting said, we need a Minister for Housing. And I was thinking initially, well, actually, you're the Minister for Housing. But then I think the point he's trying to make here is it's fairly specific, the role in DOI, and it's not about the issues that we've just been talking about, really. How do you fix a major problem like affordable housing? How do you overcome loads of investors wanting to invest in relatively cheap housing and then rent them out in the future? How do you deal with these issues? They're fairly complex issues. I often felt that housing, every time I tried to come up with simple solutions, it was very much akin to playing jack straws. You pull one straw out and suddenly a whole load of other things fall down on the other side that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, I mean, I've made very clear at the election, I think it's got to be a mixed approach, because I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all. You're quite right, Phil. It is a bit like that. You pull the straw and you hope that nothing else falls over the other side. So it's got to be a mix of things, from allowing people access to the market through a traditional first-time buyers scheme, having shared equity scheme, loan schemes, plot-to-build schemes, but also I think maybe, and I had to be convinced of this because it wasn't my stance 5 years ago, but I think with the way it's going, where it's off-island investment in people buying up houses, maybe we do need to look at caps for the first time in relation to that. But again, you mentioned DOI, and I think sometimes DOI is quite hard done to, because we seem to shove a lot into DOI. So you mentioned housing, they've also got the local government unit, of course, sat in there, along with what a lot of people would view as the DOI day job of maintaining the roads, the infrastructure and everything else that goes with it. They've got the airport, they've got the ports. So it is an absolutely expansive department, particularly for one minister. And I think maybe we do need to review the amount that we actually have in DOI and whether that's now fit for purpose. So I think that was probably what Tim was getting at during his constituency debate, when he talked about a Minister for Housing, where, if we are building up to a crisis, maybe we need someone who is purely focused on that topic. And as you know, as being a minister, you get 101 things through your desk daily. You can't always drill down into the one thing that you want to just as much as you want to.
And finally, I suppose, actually building on that point, this is one of the dangers, I think, of you've got all these newly elected MHKs. It's great that we've got so many fresh faces in there. There's great opportunity for the future. But this was said 5 years ago. Lots of new brooms. There's going to be big change. Not sure that was as big and dramatic as perhaps people expected. And part of the reason for that, of course, is there's so much of the day job, the general drudge of government, the things that have to be done coming out across your desk. It's really hard to put forward enough time to actually do the more visionary stuff, the things that will have a dramatic or create dramatic change across the island. How are you going to go about? I mean, assuming that you're going to be a minister, I know you've absolutely ruled out being chief minister, but others have ruled that out in the past and then appeared as chief minister shortly afterwards. How, if you are a minister, how are you going to be able to clear your desk to allow for the more radical visionary change that you seem to be implying needs to happen?
Well, there's several questions in there. The first, give me an opportunity again to categorically rule out myself as Chief Minister. That is not going to happen under any circumstances. I'm not going to be some compromise candidate shoved in from the middle. We'll get that out of the way to begin with. I mean, what I've found as a minister, particularly in health and social care, where you do get hundreds of issues flying around at the same time, is it's important that you don't get dragged down into the minutiae, that you allow yourself time in your calendar for strategic thinking, to actually take that step back and breathe. By trade in the private sector, I was a project manager. And it's very important in project management as well that you can get really, really pulled into the absolute small details of a project, when actually what you need to do is just take a step back and actually say, well, actually, is this going in the right direction? So I suppose if I could give any advice to incoming ministers, it would be have that strategic thinking time. Even if you're absolutely frantic, you'll run off your feet, it feels like you're getting 101 things bombarded at you, it is important that each and every week you block out that time for you just to sit back and look at it. And I think one of the big challenges the last administration's had over the last 5 years as well is, I don't want to use the word distractions, really, it's probably the wrong word, but there's been a lot of international issues that have come up. So I mean, we had Moneyval, which would have caused crisis for the economy. There was beneficial ownership as well that could have had a serious impact if that had gone through. There was the VAT negotiation, worldwide pandemic, of course, that's carrying on, and of course Brexit. Mustn't forget the thing that we all thought was the biggest problem we would face, and we went from B to C. But no. So I think the last administration, and I said this again at my hustings, has been faced with 5 serious international crises in 5 years. So it's been very much an internationally focused administration. The big challenges for the next 5 are all going to be domestic. And I think, international challenges and dealing with them does distract from domestic issues.
You prepared to put money on the fact that the next 5 years it's all going to be domestic issues?
Well, I think it needs to be domestic. Maybe needs is a better way of putting it. There will be international crises that will come along. I'm not as naive enough to say that everything's going to be plain sailing in that regard. But I think the big priority, big ticket items for the next 5 years are going to be domestic ones, and there needs to be a very clear and concise focus on that, and I think that's how we move forward with the new administration. But we'll see what that new administration brings, who the ministers are. But like I say, for whatever my advice is worth, the one thing I would say to new ministers is make sure you've still got that strategic thinking time to be able to look at the big picture.
That was David Ashford, MHK, with a thoughtful response to last week's criticism of his government team. And he almost got the figures right. Former MLC Dewan Turner is not known for holding back, and he doesn't let us down in this next piece.
As you know, the most important thing is politicians being strong enough to drive the policy and not let the tail wag the dog in terms of the officers driving the policy. And I do fear that when you've got so many new MHKs, it might be sort of, meat and drink, as they say, to some of the officers who might wish to not see as much change as what could happen. And that's a concern of mine.
you're presented with all these facts and reports and loads of information. You can really get buried in information. By being diligent, spending all your time reading reports and reading what's coming out of government, it's keeping you busy, which means you're then not able to deliver the real change perhaps that you were elected to deliver.
Well, that's right. I mean, it was very surprising when you do get in there, the amount of things you get to read. And I always say it's just not possible. It is not possible to read it all. So you have to specialise in the areas that you're focusing on, whatever those areas are. But at the same time, I think they're going to have to remember the pledge they've given the public, because a lot of them have talked about change, a lot of them have talked about accountability, and I'm already starting to see cracks in that, and we haven't even got going yet. One of the things that concerns me is a couple of the elected members now talking about creating arm's length bodies. Now, I'm sorry, but they're anything but accountable. They're less accountable than anything. This obsession that they've got with separating policy from operation, it does not work. Not in the Isle of Man, anyway. We saw that with the Manx Electricity Authority when that went belly up in a sensational fashion and is costing us to this day. So I think, they've got to really focus on what they're talking about when they talk about accountability and all of this sort of stuff, because I think half of them have said it because it sounds good, but don't actually know what it means. They've got to remember they're in the driving seat and they're there to drive the policy, not the officers.
So what's the sort of change that you expect the new House will deliver? I mean, again, there was quite a lot of hope for the next 5 years. 5 years ago, we had 12 brand new MHKs, and the view was there was going to be some fairly radical change. Now, to be fair, they've had COVID to deal with, which has perhaps held things back for a little while, but it's certainly not been a radical 5 years.
No, it hasn't. If anything, I think it's been, in terms of expenditure, quite disastrous. If you take COVID out of the equation, one of the things that I think they need to seriously look at cancelling is this Liverpool landing stage project, because the costs are going up and up and up. And I know what somebody will say, but we've spent whatever we've spent up to now, it's in the millions. Well, yeah, but does that mean we carry on pouring the millions? There's got to be a point where you say, actually, enough. We can't keep pouring more and more and more just because we've poured more and more and more in. So there's things like that they're going to have to grasp, because that's never going to repay for itself. That landing stage.
Who's your money on then for Chief Minister? Obviously, at the moment, we've only got one candidate. Alf seems very coy when pushed on the topic, but
they're both very, very able candidates, but they're both very different. It'll be whichever one is elected, we'll have a completely different administration, and maybe that's the problem with the Manx election system, because in the UK, if you vote Labour or Conservative or one of the others, you know what you're getting for the 5 years. Here, we've all went to the polls last week, and the Alf Cannon administration will be very different to an Alex Allinson administration. I think they're both very able people. I think the Isle of Man is in safe hands with either of those at the helm. How their priorities are going to pan out, I think, will be different. I always said I thought Alf Cannon would be a good choice this time round. I think he's done a lot in the hot seat of Treasury over the last 5 years. I didn't think 5 years ago he was possibly the best choice, but I think now he might well be what we need in terms of that strong leadership. But that's not to say I don't think Dr. Allinson is capable, because he is very capable of heading up the Council of Ministers.
The race is clearly on then to see who will lead us through the next 5 years. David, Michelle and Stu have all ruled themselves out, although I expect Ewan Turner would have jumped at the chance had he still been a Tynwald member. Alex Allinson and Alf Cannon remain hotly tipped to be in the running, but will there be a dark horse candidate? I hope you've enjoyed tonight's agenda. Next week, the focus shifts to who will lead the Council of Ministers through the next 5 years. Let me know if you agree or disagree with anything you heard on the show, and please tell me if you'd like to add anything to your future agenda. But for now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Guramayu. Thanks for listening.